She was 7 months pregnant the day she came to sign away her marriage, and the man across the table had no idea he was about to lose the only thing he had ever truly wanted. By the time the pen touched paper, Hannah Carter had already rebuilt herself from the ashes of his contempt. The law office overlooking the Chicago River gleamed with polished glass and quiet wealth, the kind of place where reputations were protected and feelings were dismantled with professional precision. Hannah stepped out of the elevator at 10 in the morning, her posture straight. Her movements controlled the soft wool of her tailored navy coat, concealing the curve of her abdomen. At 34, she had learned that courage was not loud. It was measured, deliberate, almost invisible until the moment it struck. Daniel Brooks was already seated inside Conference Room 3, reviewing documents with the same detached focus he used when closing multi-million-dollar real estate deals. At 40, he carried success like a second-skin sharp suit, expensive watch confidence bordering on arrogance. He believed in outcomes, not emotions. When Hannah entered, he expected to see the woman he had left behind 6 months earlier fragile, diminished, still orbiting his approval. Instead, he found someone composed, luminous, in a way he could not immediately define. His gaze lingered a second too long before he masked it with indifference. Margaret Lewis, Hannah's attorney, nodded subtly as Hannah took her seat, placing her handbag carefully on the table as though setting down the final weight of a long burden. The room filled with the dry cadence of legal language. Assets, accounts, property distribution. Daniel spoke efficiently, eager to conclude what he considered an unfortunate but necessary inconvenience. He had already moved on with Lauren Mitchell, a younger marketing executive who fit neatly into the image he preferred. He told himself this meeting was a formality, yet something unsettled him. Hannah did not interrupt. She did not plead. She did not display the quiet desperation he once accused her of hiding. Her hands rested lightly over her midsection, a gesture so natural he nearly missed it. When she removed her coat at Margaret's suggestion, time shifted. The fabric parted and the truth stood between them, undeniable. Daniel's breath caught. The curve was unmistakable. "That's not possible," he said too quickly, rising from his chair, the scrape of wood against marble sharp and sudden. "We tried for years. The doctors said the chances were nearly nothing." His voice cracked on the final word, not from sadness, but from disbelief. Hannah met his stare with steady eyes that no longer sought validation. "They said the chances were low," she replied evenly. "You decided that meant impossible." The memory surged through both of them like a violent current. A winter night in their penthouse. Snow against the windows. Daniel's words cutting deeper than any storm. What kind of wife cannot give her husband a child? The sentence had shattered her then. Now it sounded small. How far along, he demanded, though the answer was already forming in his mind. 7 months, she said softly. The number struck him harder than any accusation. 7 months meant the child had been conceived before he left, before he announced to friends that the marriage had failed because she was incapable. His attorney shifted uncomfortably, sensing the power dynamic tilting. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, composure fraying. "This changes everything," he insisted, stepping closer as if proximity could restore control. "We can reconsider. For the baby. We can fix this." The words revealed him completely. Not love, not remorse. Strategy. Hannah felt the old ache flicker then fade. In the months since he walked out, she had rented a modest apartment facing the lake, taken freelance design projects, attended prenatal appointments alone, but unbroken. She had rediscovered her own rhythm, her own worth beyond his approval. She understood now that motherhood did not bind her to humiliation. It freed her from it. "The baby will have a father," she said with calm authority. "But I will not be your wife." The finality in her voice stunned him more than the pregnancy itself. Daniel had built an empire on anticipating outcomes. He had never anticipated this version of her. Margaret slid the final documents forward, the papers whispering across the table like a closing curtain. Hannah reached for the pen. For a fleeting second, Daniel searched her face for hesitation, for softness he could exploit. He found none. Her signature flowed across the page, deliberate and unwavering. In that quiet motion, the balance of power shifted permanently. Daniel realized too late that he had mistaken gentleness for weakness and silence for surrender. The woman he tried to diminish had carried life within her while carrying her own rebirth. And as the ink dried, he understood that he was not just losing a marriage. He was witnessing the rise of someone he had profoundly underestimated. Daniel did not leave the conference room when Hannah walked out. He remained standing beside the table as though the ground beneath him had shifted and he was recalculating his balance. The signed documents lay between them like a verdict, but his mind was not on legal clauses or asset divisions. It was on the word 7. 7 months. The number circled him relentlessly, each repetition tightening around his chest. He had built his life on precision, on anticipating risk before it surfaced, yet he had failed to foresee the most human outcome of all. Hannah had conceived the very thing he had accused her of being incapable of, and she had done it quietly, without spectacle, without vengeance. That silence unsettled him more than any argument ever could. Margaret Lewis gathered her folders with efficient calm, offering Daniel a polite nod that held no sympathy. She had witnessed countless divorces crumble into bitterness, but this one had inverted itself with ruthless elegance. Daniel was accustomed to being the one who controlled exits. Now he stood in the aftermath of a decision he could not reverse. He replayed the past year in fractured flashes, the fertility appointments, the sterile clinics, the nights he withdrew into work, the growing resentment he disguised as logic. He remembered the final argument, his voice rising sharp and cold, telling Hannah he deserved more. In that moment he had believed himself justified. Now he saw the cruelty in it with brutal clarity. Outside the building, Hannah inhaled the crisp Chicago air as if it were the first breath she had taken in years. The wind lifted strands of her hair and carried with it the faint scent of rain. She walked slowly toward the parking garage, one hand resting lightly over her abdomen, feeling the subtle shift of life beneath her palm. The city moved around her with indifference, taxis, honking pedestrians, rushing skyscrapers gleaming under a pale sky. Yet within her something sacred stirred. She was no longer the woman who measured herself against a man's approval. She was becoming someone else entirely, someone anchored in purpose. The child inside her was not a bargaining chip. It was a promise. Daniel caught up to her just before she reached her car. "Hannah, wait." His voice lacked its usual authority, edged instead with urgency he did not know how to mask. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze without hostility but without warmth. "You can't expect me to just accept this," he said, his hand slicing through the air as if negotiating a contract. "A child changes everything. We could rebuild. We could fix what broke." His words tumbled out quickly now, stripped of polish. For the first time, he sounded less like a titan of industry and more like a man confronting loss. Hannah studied him carefully, seeing the layers she once admired: ambition, intelligence, drive. But she also saw the fear beneath them, the fear of losing control, of losing legacy, of losing face. "You don't want me back," she said quietly. "You want the version of the future you imagined." The statement struck with surgical precision. Daniel opened his mouth to argue, then faltered. In his mind, fatherhood had always been intertwined with pride, with continuation of his name, with boardroom conversations about heirs. He had not imagined it arriving in the wake of his own dismissal. "I was angry," he said, finally, voice roughened. "I said things I didn't mean." The confession hung between them, fragile and late. Hannah remembered every word. Useless, defective, disappointment. Those words had carved scars no apology could erase. She did not hate him. Hatred required energy she no longer possessed. What she felt instead was distance, a widening gulf created not by the pregnancy but by years of emotional erosion. "Anger reveals truth," she replied softly. "And I needed to believe you when you showed me who you were." Traffic roared faintly in the background as silence settled again. Daniel realized that persuasion would not bend her. This was not negotiation. This was finality. He had underestimated the depth of her resilience, mistaking her quiet for submission. Now that quiet had transformed into unshakable resolve. "I'll fight for joint custody," he said at last, the businessman resurfacing in him. "I won't disappear from my child's life." There it was again. Assertion, positioning, control. Hannah nodded once. "And you shouldn't disappear," she said evenly. "But you will show up as a father, not as my husband." The distinction cut cleanly. Daniel watched her unlock her car, slide into the driver's seat, and close the door with steady hands. As the engine started, he saw something he had never truly recognized before: strength that did not need his validation. The car pulled away smoothly, merging into traffic, carrying with it a future he had once claimed she could never give him. And for the first time, Daniel understood that power does not always belong to the one who speaks the loudest. Sometimes it belongs to the one who walks away without looking back. The night Daniel realized he had destroyed his own certainty, he did not go home to Lauren. He drove instead to the penthouse he once shared with Hannah, and stood in the dark listening to the echo of a life that no longer answered him. The silence inside the glass walls pressed against him louder than any argument they had ever had. He poured himself a drink he did not want and stared at the skyline, replaying the memory he had tried so hard to justify. The night he called her defective. The night he convinced himself cruelty was honesty. He had believed ambition excused everything. He had believed results mattered more than tenderness. Hannah, meanwhile, returned to her apartment by the lake, a modest space compared to the towering penthouse she once inhabited, yet warmer in ways money had never purchased. The living room held soft lamplight, half-finished design sketches scattered across the dining table, and a quiet stillness that felt like safety rather than absence. She lowered herself onto the couch slowly, one hand resting over her abdomen, feeling the steady reminder that she was not alone. The child shifted gently, a subtle flutter that felt like reassurance. In that small movement, she sensed something radical. She was enough. Not because she had proven Daniel wrong, not because she had conceived at last, but because she had survived the breaking. The flashbacks did not disappear simply because the papers were signed. They arrived in fragments, sharp and intrusive. The sterile fertility clinic with its white walls and polite nurses, the doctor explaining probabilities with detached professionalism, Daniel sitting beside her, jaw tight, eyes distant, calculating odds as if they were stock market forecasts. When the treatments failed, his disappointment hardened into accusation. He had not shouted at first. He withdrew. He worked later. He stopped touching her. Then one January night, after a deal collapsed, he erupted. What kind of wife cannot give her husband a child? The words ricocheted through her memory now, but they no longer pierced. They echoed instead as evidence. Daniel did not sleep that night. His phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from Lauren asking why he had disappeared after the meeting. He ignored them. For the first time, he examined the timeline without self-defense. 7 months meant the pregnancy began before he packed his bags, before he told friends that the marriage had simply run its course. He had built a narrative that cast himself as pragmatic, as someone unwilling to remain trapped in disappointment. That narrative fractured now. He had not left because she failed. He had left because he feared being the one who was powerless. The possibility that the problem had never been Hannah unsettled him deeply. The following morning, Hannah attended her prenatal appointment alone, just as she had for the past months. The clinic was modest, filled with women of every background, each carrying her own story. Dr. Ethan Walker, a calm and perceptive physician in his late 30s, greeted her with quiet warmth. He reviewed her chart, listening carefully as she described the previous day. There was no judgment in his eyes, only steady concern. When he placed the monitor against her abdomen and the rapid heartbeat filled the room strong and rhythmic, Hannah felt tears gather unexpectedly. The sound was undeniable. Alive, defiant. Ethan glanced at her gently. That he said softly is strength. Back at his office, Daniel requested a paternity test through his attorney, masking insecurity as legal prudence. He told himself it was procedural necessary. Yet beneath the rationalization lived fear. What if the child was not his? What if it was? Both possibilities threatened his ego in different ways. For years he had defined himself by outcomes he could influence. This was different. This was life unfolding without his command. When Margaret Lewis responded with clinical efficiency, confirming Hannah's willingness to comply, Daniel felt something unexpected relief mixed with shame. She had nothing to hide. She never had. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the city, Hannah stood by her window and watched the water darken into ink. She reflected on the woman she had been eager to please, willing to shrink for the sake of harmony. That version had dissolved, slowly, painfully replaced by someone quieter, but far more solid. She no longer needed to prove her worth through motherhood or marriage. The child growing inside her was not validation. It was simply love. Daniel believed he was fighting for legacy. Hannah understood she was building something deeper, not an empire, a foundation. Lauren Mitchell chose the worst possible moment to demand clarity. She was standing in Daniel's high-rise office when she learned the truth, her reflection fractured in the glass walls as he finally told her about the pregnancy. For weeks she had sensed distance, his distracted silences, the way he stared at nothing mid-conversation. When he said the word 7 months, her composure shattered. "You told me she couldn't have children," she said sharply, her voice rising in disbelief. Daniel did not answer immediately because he did not know how to defend a narrative that had collapsed under its own arrogance. Lauren had built her expectations carefully. At 28, she believed she was stepping into a future shaped by ambition and wealth. She had accepted Daniel's version of events without question, a failed marriage, a woman who could not give him what he needed, a clean break. Now she realized she had been walking into unfinished history. So what does this mean? She pressed arms, crossed, fear hidden beneath indignation. Daniel rubbed his temples, feeling the pressure close in. It meant complication. It meant responsibility. It meant he was no longer in control of the story he had written about himself. Across the city, Hannah felt none of that chaos. She was rearranging the small nursery corner in her apartment, assembling a crib she had ordered online with deliberate patience. The instructions were simple, the screws tight beneath her careful hands. She worked slowly, steady, despite the weight she carried. Every movement felt symbolic. She was building something piece by piece, something that would not collapse under harsh words or wounded pride. The room smelled faintly of fresh wood and lavender detergent. It was not grand. It was enough. The paternity test results arrived sooner than Daniel expected. He opened the envelope alone in his office, the heavy paper crisp beneath his fingers. The confirmation was clinical and absolute. The child was his. The certainty struck him with unexpected force. He had prepared himself for doubt, for another twist he could deflect. Instead, he was confronted with fact. His legacy was no longer hypothetical. It was growing, breathing, and tied to the woman he had dismissed. He sank into his chair, staring at the skyline, realizing that ambition had never required cruelty. That had been his choice. He called Hannah that evening, his voice measured but stripped of its former superiority. The results came in, he said quietly. "I know." Hannah's tone was calm. She had anticipated the call, anticipated the shift. "I want to be involved. he continued, and for once there was no negotiation in his voice, only admission. "I don't want to be the man who walks away." The sentence lingered between them, vulnerable and unfamiliar. Hannah listened carefully, weighing sincerity against habit. She heard the difference, subtle but present. "You can be involved," she replied, standing by the window as twilight painted the lake in muted blues. "But involvement means respect, not control." Daniel exhaled slowly, absorbing the boundary. For years he had equated leadership with dominance. Now he was being asked to participate without ownership. It unsettled him. It humbled him. "I understand," he said, though he was still learning what that truly meant. On the other end of the line, Hannah rested her hand over her abdomen, feeling a gentle kick that felt like agreement. Lauren, meanwhile, made her own decision. She did not confront Hannah. She did not attempt drama. Instead, she stepped back from Daniel with calculated dignity. She understood now that she had been part of a transition, not a future. Ambition without loyalty felt hollow. Within a week, she accepted a position in another city, choosing distance over entanglement. When she informed Daniel, he nodded without protest. For the first time, he did not attempt persuasion. He was beginning to understand that consequences did not negotiate. As autumn deepened, the distance between Hannah and Daniel transformed into something unexpected. Not reconciliation, not friendship, something steadier. A structured communication built around the child they would share. Each conversation carried less accusation, more clarity. Daniel found himself reconsidering the values he had once dismissed as weakness. Hannah found herself surprised by the quiet evolution of a man she thought she fully understood. Yet she did not mistake growth for redemption. She had crossed a threshold that could not be reversed. Late one evening, as Hannah finished folding tiny cotton blankets and placed them neatly inside the crib, she paused and allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. The future remained uncertain. There would be custody agreements, adjustments, sleepless nights, but she no longer feared what lay ahead. The woman who once absorbed humiliation had become someone who defined her own terms. Daniel might be learning humility. Lauren might be rewriting her path. But Hannah had already claimed hers, and this time it was built on unshakable ground. By the time winter settled over Chicago, Hannah no longer flinched when her phone lit up with Daniel's name, but she no longer softened either. The divorce was finalized, the paternity confirmed, and yet something unfinished lingered between them like the final note of a song that refused to fade. Daniel had begun attending prenatal appointments when invited, sitting quietly beside her in the clinic waiting room, his tailored coat folded over his arm, looking strangely out of place among pastel walls and parenting magazines. He did not dominate the space the way he once dominated boardrooms. He listened. He asked measured questions. He watched the monitor when the baby's heartbeat filled the room, and in those moments his expression shifted from calculation to awe. Hannah noticed the change, but did not let it dismantle her boundaries. Growth was not the same as trust. She had spent too many nights rebuilding herself to risk erosion again. Still, when Daniel offered to assemble the final bookshelf in the nursery, she allowed it. He worked carefully. Sleeves rolled up, hands steadier than she remembered. There were no sharp comments, no impatience, only focus. When he finished, he stepped back, as though presenting a finished project, then caught himself and simply nodded. The subtle humility did not go unnoticed. Yet the world beyond their fragile cooperation did not remain silent. News of the pregnancy had begun circulating quietly within Daniel's professional circle. Whispers followed him through charity galas and investor dinners. Some congratulated him. Others questioned the timing of his divorce. The narrative he once controlled was now being rewritten without his input. A prominent business associate asked bluntly over dinner whether he had miscalculated his personal life the way he would never miscalculate a deal. Daniel forced a composed smile, but the comment lingered long after the evening ended. Reputation had always been currency to him. Now it felt secondary. One afternoon, as Hannah left a prenatal yoga class, she found Daniel waiting by her car. Snow drifted lightly around him, settling on his dark coat. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a man rehearsing words he did not know how to deliver. "I've been offered a partnership expansion," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. It would mean traveling frequently. New York, Los Angeles, maybe overseas. The implication hung heavy. Hannah studied him, sensing the internal conflict. This was the kind of opportunity he once would have accepted without hesitation, and she asked calmly, "And I'm considering turning it down." The admission landed softly but carried weight. Daniel had never declined advancement before. Ambition had been his compass. "I don't want to be a visitor in my child's life," he continued, his voice quieter now. "I don't want to show up only when it's convenient." The statement was not dramatic. It was stripped of performance. Hannah felt a subtle shift inside her. Not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. He was confronting the cost of his own priorities. "You have to decide what kind of father you want to be," she replied. "But that decision can't depend on me." The clarity in her tone reinforced the distance she maintained. She would not become the axis around which he restructured his identity. That work belonged to him alone. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the truth. For the first time in years, he was choosing not based on prestige, but on presence. The tension reached a quiet climax when Daniel invited Hannah to dinner at a neutral restaurant to discuss a formal parenting plan. The atmosphere was restrained, both of them aware that this was not a reconciliation, but a negotiation of responsibility. He outlined schedules, financial commitments, educational funds. She listened, occasionally adjusting terms to ensure stability rather than convenience. There was no bitterness in her corrections, only precision. Daniel noticed that she no longer reacted emotionally to his tone. She simply responded from a place of grounded certainty. That realization unsettled him more than anger ever could. As they concluded the discussion, Daniel hesitated before speaking again. "I was wrong," he said, finally, the words almost foreign in his mouth. "About you. About everything." It was not a grand apology. It was not theatrical. It was simple, honest. Hannah felt the echo of past pain stir, but it did not overpower her. "I know," she said gently. And in that response was not superiority, but closure. Outside, the snow had thickened, coating the city in quiet white. Hannah walked toward her car, one hand resting over the steady life within her. Daniel remained on the sidewalk, watching her leave, understanding now that redemption was not something granted in a single conversation. It was earned through consistency, through humility, through time. And as he stood there, he realized something that would have once seemed impossible. Power was no longer defined by expansion or acquisition. It was defined by who he chose to become when no one was applauding. The night Hannah went into labor, the city was caught in a late winter storm, the kind that blurred headlights and turned familiar streets into uncertain paths. She woke at 2:17 in the morning to a sharp, insistent pressure that stole her breath and left no room for denial. For a moment she lay still, one hand braced against her abdomen, listening to the wind rattle the windows of her apartment. Then the second contraction came stronger, decisive. This was no rehearsal. This was arrival. She called Daniel before she called anyone else. The decision surprised even her, but it felt right. He answered on the second ring, voice thick with sleep, then instantly alert, as she explained between steady breaths. Within 15 minutes, he was at her door, hair unstyled, coat thrown over a sweater, eyes wide, not with panic, but with urgency. He did not attempt control. He followed her lead, He carried the hospital bag she had packed weeks earlier, the one filled with carefully folded onesies and documents placed in exact order. Outside, snow swirled under streetlights as they drove through near-empty roads toward the hospital. Inside the maternity ward, time fractured into measured intervals of pain and determination. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency. Monitors beeped softly, tracking rhythms beyond sight. Daniel stayed beside her, not hovering, not commanding, but present. He held her hand through contractions, counting breaths when she asked, silent when she needed quiet. In those hours, stripped of boardrooms and public image, he was simply a man witnessing the raw strength of a woman he had once underestimated. He watched her grit her teeth, push through exhaustion, and refuse to surrender to fear. Awe replaced regret. Respect replaced assumption. When the first cry pierced the room just after 9 in the morning, it was not delicate. It was fierce, alive. The nurse placed the baby against Hannah's chest, and for a suspended second the world narrowed to skin against skin warmth, against trembling hands. "A boy," someone announced softly. Daniel exhaled a breath he had been holding for months. He stared at his son as though studying a miracle he did not deserve, but desperately wanted to protect. The child's fingers curled instinctively, grasping air, then finding Hannah's thumb with surprising strength. They named him Noah. The days that followed unfolded in a blur of exhaustion and fragile joy. Daniel remained at the hospital longer than required sleeping upright in a chair without complaint. He learned how to change diapers with awkward precision, how to swaddle without fumbling, how to hold his son with a confidence that grew hour by hour. Nurses assumed they were a reconciled couple. Hannah did not correct them. The label did not matter. What mattered was that Noah felt safe in both their arms. When Hannah brought Noah home, the apartment felt transformed. The crib no longer symbolic, but occupied. The bookshelf Daniel had assembled now holding tiny storybooks instead of anticipation. Late nights stretched into early mornings as feedings blurred the boundary between day and darkness. Daniel adjusted his schedule, declining evening engagements, delegating meetings he once guarded fiercely. His colleagues noticed the shift. Some questioned it. He no longer defended himself. For the first time, absence from the spotlight felt like presence where it mattered. One evening, as Hannah rocked Noah near the window overlooking the lake, Daniel stood quietly nearby. Snow had begun to melt, revealing the first signs of early spring. "I don't want to complicate your life," he said carefully, voice low so as not to disturb the sleeping child. "But I want to earn my place in his." The sentence carried humility, not entitlement. Hannah looked up at him, studying the sincerity etched into his features. She saw the man he had been and the man he was attempting to become. They were not identical. "You don't earn your place through promises," she replied softly. "You earn it through consistency." The words were not harsh, they were clear. Daniel nodded, absorbing them without defense. He understood now that transformation was not declared. It was demonstrated. As night settled, the apartment grew quiet except for the steady rhythm of Noah's breathing. Hannah felt an unfamiliar calm wash over her, deeper than relief, steadier than triumph. She had feared this chapter, once imagined single motherhood as an uphill battle against judgment and exhaustion. Instead, she found herself standing in a new landscape shaped not by loss, but by choice. Daniel might be rewriting his identity. The world might be watching. But in that small room, illuminated by soft lamplight and the gentle rise and fall of her son's chest, Hannah understood something profound. Power was not reclaiming a broken marriage. It was creating a life that no one could diminish again. By the time Noah turned 6 months old, the fragile truce between Hannah and Daniel had matured into something steadier, less emotional, more deliberate. They were not rebuilding a romance. They were constructing a partnership defined by boundaries and shared devotion. Daniel arrived every Wednesday evening and every other weekend without fail, no longer late, no longer distracted. He learned the rhythm of Noah's naps, the particular way his son preferred to be held, the soft hum that soothed him when restlessness set in. Consistency replaced apology. Presence replaced pride. The world, however, was less forgiving than the small apartment by the lake. Articles began circulating in business columns about Daniel's reduced travel schedule, about his surprising decision to decline a high-profile expansion opportunity. Speculation followed him into board meetings. Some framed it as weakness, others as distraction. A rival executive suggested quietly that fatherhood had softened his edge. Daniel read the headlines without responding publicly. For years he had chased admiration like oxygen. Now he understood its cost. If being perceived as less aggressive meant being present for his son, he accepted the recalibration. One afternoon, while Daniel was visiting, a delivery arrived at Hannah's door. It was not baby supplies or business documents. It was a bouquet of white lilies with a handwritten note from Lauren. The message was brief and unexpectedly sincere. She congratulated Hannah, wished Noah health, and acknowledged in her own restrained way that timing had taught her humility. Hannah read it once and placed it gently on the kitchen counter. She did not feel jealousy. She felt closure. Daniel, noticing the card, said nothing. The silence carried mutual understanding. The past no longer demanded defense. As spring edged into early summer, Hannah returned gradually to freelance work, balancing design deadlines with motherhood. She worked during Noah's naps, her laptop open beside baby monitors and scattered toys. Clients praised her renewed focus, unaware that resilience sharpened creativity. She was not merely recovering from a failed marriage, she was expanding into someone more defined. Motherhood had not diminished her ambition, it had refined it. She chose projects carefully, prioritizing flexibility over prestige, stability over spectacle. The subtle climax arrived during a charity gala. Daniel was obligated to attend one he once would have navigated effortlessly. He invited Hannah not as a romantic gesture, but as Noah's mother, as part of the life he no longer compartmentalized. She hesitated, then agreed. When they entered the ballroom, whispers rippled through the crowd. Some remembered the divorce, others the pregnancy revelation. A few expected tension. Instead, they saw composure. Daniel did not distance himself from her presence. He introduced her calmly, respectfully, not as an ex-wife, as Noah's mother. In that moment, Hannah felt the weight of past humiliation dissolve completely. She was no longer the woman judged for what she could not give. She stood grounded, self-assured, aware that her power had never depended on proximity to Daniel's success. The applause that followed a later speech meant little compared to the quiet text message she received from the babysitter, Noah, asleep, breathing steady. Daniel noticed her smile as she read it. He understood the hierarchy of her priorities. When they stepped outside into the warm night air, city lights reflecting against the river, Daniel spoke softly. "Thank you for coming." The gratitude was genuine, free of performance. Hannah looked at him not with longing, not with resentment, but with clarity. "We are both here for him," she replied. And in that simple truth lay the transformation of everything they once misunderstood. Years passed, not with dramatic declarations, but with quiet, steady proof. Noah grew from an infant wrapped in soft blankets into a curious boy who asked endless questions about airplanes, bridges, and why the moon followed the car at night. His laughter filled Hannah's apartment in ways that once felt unimaginable. The space that had begun as a refuge became a home defined by warmth and intention. Toys scattered across the floor did not represent chaos. They represented life unfolding without fear. Hannah watched her son build towers from wooden blocks, knock them down, and rebuild without frustration. Resilience, she realized, was learned through example. Daniel's transformation did not occur overnight, nor was it flawless. There were moments of regression, flashes of impatience, echoes of the man he once was. But they became fewer, softer, replaced by a deliberate effort to show up consistently. He attended school orientations, pediatric appointments, parent meetings. He listened more than he spoke. His colleagues noticed that his ambition had not vanished. It had matured. He no longer pursued expansion for applause, but for stability. He structured his business in a way that allowed presence rather than constant absence. The empire he once prioritized now served a different purpose. It funded a future, not an ego. Hannah, meanwhile, experienced her own quiet evolution. Her freelance work flourished into a respected design consultancy built from her dining table and expanded through referrals earned by integrity. Clients admired her precision and calm leadership, unaware that both had been forged in emotional fire. She hired a small team, mentored young designers, and structured her schedule around Noah's school hours. She did not seek headlines. She sought balance. In private moments, she reflected on the woman who once believed love required shrinking. That version felt distant, now almost unfamiliar. The final turning point arrived on Noah's 5th birthday. They hosted the celebration at a park overlooking the lake, simple decorations fluttering in the breeze. Daniel arrived early to help set up tying balloons with careful focus, while Hannah arranged a modest cake on a folding table. There were no lavish displays, no extravagant gestures, just children running across grass, parents chatting under sunlight, laughter carried by wind. At one point, Noah grabbed both of their hands, pulling them toward the playground with fierce enthusiasm. In that spontaneous gesture, something unspoken solidified. Not reconciliation, not romance, partnership. Later, as the sun dipped low and guests began to leave, Daniel stood beside Hannah, watching Noah chase soap bubbles with boundless determination. "I used to think success meant being untouchable," Daniel admitted quietly. "Now I understand it means being accountable." His voice carried no regret, only awareness. Hannah studied him for a moment, recognizing the sincerity not in his words alone, but in the years of consistent action behind them. She did not respond with praise. She responded with acknowledgement, a subtle nod that carried more weight than forgiveness ever could. As twilight settled over the park, Hannah felt an overwhelming sense of calm. The past no longer defined her. It informed her. She had walked into a law office years ago carrying life and dignity beneath a tailored coat. She had been underestimated, dismissed, judged by a narrative she did not write. Now she stood grounded in a story she authored herself. Daniel might have learned humility. Noah might have inherited resilience. But the greatest transformation belonged to her. She no longer sought validation from love. She embodied it. And in that quiet certainty beneath fading light and rising stars, Hannah understood that the most powerful revenge had never been retaliation. It had been growth. From a psychological and behavioral perspective, Hannah's journey reflects a powerful truth. Real transformation does not happen when circumstances change, but when identity shifts. She did not win by proving Daniel wrong. She won by no longer needing his validation. Experts often describe this as emotional sovereignty, the ability to define one's worth internally rather than externally. Daniel's arc, in contrast, shows that growth is possible but only when accountability replaces ego. And Noah becomes the living bridge between two people who learned in very different ways what truly matters. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like and subscribe so you do not miss more stories that explore strength, healing, and real human transformation. And I would love to hear from you. What is one phrase that captures this journey for you? Drop it in the comments below. Your turn. Choose yourself.